So at this time, we were just going to do a few questions, maybe amongst these folks. I'll play the role of Wolf Blitzer. But then we'll take a few questions from the audience as well. But I did want to follow up, though, on your comment about collaboration. How do we get collaboration within the project value chain to achieve cost and emissions? I mean, are you finding that to be a challenge, or do you think that's a fairly easy sell?
It's not really, I find it's not really a big challenge. Actually, if anything, we're getting a lot of lots of draw. Especially, and the reason we're getting lots of draw and when it comes is because large companies are looking for an advantage always. And when they see something like this, they see an advantage. Our problem is we can't address all of them. But I think, and also with universities, we have a large network of universities, and I find they're very eager to work with us, very, very eager to do something. And I love working with the kids at universities because they're so ambitious, and when they use a very open mindset, we get very open, interesting concepts that come out. Love to work with them. And so I find it's mostly making sure we have funding set aside that we can actually do these things. The funding is the most important piece to make sure we have that there so that we can do that work. But actually not that hard. We got more in the basket.
That's good. Yeah, one would expect it to be a little bit more challenging.
No, actually,
that's
no.
Great. All right. So Margaret Cederroth, do you think California high-speed rail project sets a precedent for other states to do the same? And if so, what do you think might be the hurdles to see high-speed rail on the East Coast, for example?
Okay. Well, I'm going to take your precedent question two ways. So California was one of the recipients of, and part of the ambitious program laid out in the late aughts, right, to introduce high-speed rail throughout the United States, right? There was a goal of connecting 75% of the people in the United States to high-speed rail. That plan, high-speed rail in California, is a really great demonstration of that, right? It is the right transportation tool for the space and the population densities that we have. And we have a number of places elsewhere in the United States where that can happen. And so, we look at Texas coming online with high-speed rail. We look at Florida introducing higher speed rails. We look at the high-speed rail that exists in the Northeast Corridor, high-ish speed rail that exists in the Northeast Corridor. But I think demonstrating true high-speed rail at 220-mile-an-hour speeds in California is actually going to set a pretty key precedent for the rest of the United States, and it's intended to operate without subsidies, right? So it really is a value proposition in terms of what we can deliver with a transportation good. And then I think we also, in the construction side, are setting a precedent. And admittedly, it does, we have a great foundation because of California's laws, but there's also ways that we're looking at as we said, right, 30% of emissions come from the construction industry, right? That is a good chunk of, let's call it opportunity, right, to address in terms of what we're doing. And so the more we can prove concepts on high-speed rail, right, that we can do something that is delivering emissions reductions at low cost or value to the contractor, to the owner, I think that is incredibly powerful for a pretty powerful pilot.
Yeah.
So, well, that's a good segue, because how important do you think, both of you think, is cost? You mentioned value prop. I saw your slide was 25% reduction. I mean, so I guess the question is, should we spend more to be more sustainable, or does it always have to translate to a cost value proposition, or are there other value propositions that sort of equalize the increased cost that one might see in a project?
I'm going to start on this one because it's always in advanced work. I mean, you're always struggling a little bit with cost. But so I think the way I look at it is, I think a key word is value, innovations that customers value. And so if I go like that, so if we have innovations that customers value, then you have an opportunity. So that's why I always look for the sickness before I make the pill. And if I then can find out what is the key to that economically, then I think that's interesting. One of the biggest things in this area, especially with electric vehicles, is watching the curve of battery costs. That's really super important because it's a big part of the cost of the vehicles. And as that transitions, you can ask yourself, when are you going to buy an electric car? So when are you going to buy an electric car? When it gets cheaper, right? That's when you're going to buy. Otherwise, if I make $500,000 a year, I'm going to buy a Tesla right now. But not everybody does that, right? So as soon as it gets under $30,000 or around that number, it's just going to go whoop, and it's all based on the cost of the technology. So I think that'll be a big driver.
Right. You know, you asked, that is a great question. I know everyone who works in the sustainability space, right, we recognize we're trying to bring environmental and social values, right, the externalities that got ignored into that life cycle equation, life cycle cost equation, right? So the more, I think there's a lot more happening in the space that's appreciating the cost of our externalities, our pollution and our GHG emissions, that's actually kind of writing the balance when we look at how we approach what is the true capital cost of a given solution. But I think there's also, I mean, you mentioned innovation and what happens, how we get to innovation. And it's been exciting to see things like, you know, the use of renewable diesel. And I know that that is tied very closely to the fact that California set the low carbon fuel standard, and there are other credits available, right? There's that public sector side kind of incentivizing behavior. But the more that our, you know, contracts and construction activities can require that, you start establishing a market for these greener products and greener opportunities. And so that kind of cost starts to go away, right? It just becomes how we do business.
I'm gonna add something though, to qualify my statement, because I think it's interesting. I think also this is to me, it's a question of leadership.
Yes.
Okay, because who's investing? Who has been investing in solar cells before it became what it is now, and why were they? And it's usually through the leadership. What could be governmental leadership, could be company leadership that believes in something, right? And I think it's really important that when I talked about sustainable earlier, that it's economic, environmental, and social, that you have to believe in that. Because if you believe in that, then you invest in that, right? So you can't have a short-term thinking. You got to have a long-term thinking, and you got to have leadership that believes in this, and be willing to put some investment into that, or subsidy, or whatever. I think that's super important. Unless we have that, game over.
Right.
So.
You stole the question off my paper. So this is a great segue then. When we talk about leadership and we talk about the construction industry being, sort of leading the way, but do you feel the construction industry as a whole, and perhaps with your efforts with the high-speed rail project, is the construction industry on the leading edge or the bleeding edge, or somewhere in between, or in what facets of the industry might be leading and lagging?
What's interesting about construction, I mean, when you think about technology and these kinds of technologies, often it trickles. I don't want to say trickle down economics because I really don't believe in that. But what it is really it trickles down from automotive because of its size, right? Its size and the volumes drive reduced costs of sensors and everything. And if you just think about batteries for a second, the whole gigafactory thing, I mean, it isn't just Elon doing it, BYD is doing it, LG Chem is doing it. And why is that important that they're investing so much? It's because it'll drive the costs down on batteries overall, right? So I think overall this is I think we are behind drawing that in, and our off-highway work is it's very different in different places, so it isn't as easy to bring in. So, but I think some people will predict. I think it might be. Some people will predict that almost every vehicle sold anywhere in the world after 2025, some people predict, will be electric, new ones, right? I think it's going to last for a while, but. We'll be sucked along with the economics and the industry, basically, is what will happen.
Well, really quick, I think we all know that contractors do things because they are obeying their contract or they can do it cheaper. And so I think that innovation does enter into that space, right? You get a little more efficiency. You get people paying attention to how they can do something quicker, cheaper, more efficient. And I think that the more we can incentivize around that sort of DNA in the contractor, I think the more you start to see the construction industry. But I think the collaboration across, manufacturers, suppliers, contractors, all kind of has to come together to work toward that common end. So I know the more owners can do to sort of set that requirement, we can work towards those kind of greener bars as well, and not just be about cost.
Okay. I think Magnus wants to get the mic.
We want to do a couple questions from the audience. Any questions from the audience?
I just have one question. You had one slide there which showed the social impact, right?
Yeah.
And I think, I've been working around the world for many years, and I've seen the innovation, how it came into the mining and quarries around the world, and specifically, I'm thinking of India, for example, a country with 1 billion people and growing at the rate of 6, 7, 8%, right?
Yeah.
And
1.3 right now.
1.3 right now, thank you. Encyclopedia, Mr. Encyclopedia here.
We follow you.
But my question on the social impact is, because we talk about communities, right? And with the innovation, this is a more philosophical question, and I don't know, I don't have the answer to it. But when you look at these communities out there, in India or in China, a lot of people do manual work, a lot of people do their small truck owners, operators, and when we brought in the new technologies, and this is now, say, 15, 20 years ago, and we could replace with one truck, with our articulated haul truck, 10 or 15 or 20 small trucks. What happened? 20 people were out of work. So my question is the innovation. Now when I see these autonomous machines, it's all great. It's great for environment, but at the end of the day, we actually, what's going to happen? How are we going to employ, and what the people going to do when everything's going to be done by machines? So I think there's some social implication to this, which we need to figure out how we will not just make the work more efficient, but how we will then support all these communities which actually will have nothing to do.
Yeah. I mean, it is definitely a philosophical, we could go on for a long time on that one. but it is definitely a philosophical question. It's often asked, automation, how it's going to if you go back to I think it was an article I read, it was a historical article from 1830 or 20, in that range. And they were bringing in certain mechanized machines. And the government, the workers were going wild. You're going to displace all these people. But in reality, it actually morphed into something else. Now, some people will give that answer that it will morph into other kinds of jobs. We don't have as many horses, so we don't have as many horsewhip makers, but now they're making cars. So I think my thinking, I have twofold thinking on this. One is there'll be some displacement like that, because I think innovation is fun to talk about, but maintenance is very important, super important. Yeah. So those 7 trucks that are running around, somebody has to take care of those.
Right.
Like, they just don't live forever by themselves. There's bearings in them and things you got to. So there's this kind of maintenance I think will happen in some way, but I don't think it'll take it all up. And I think actually governments and many, I think as a society, we need to think, at one time we had to work 7 days a week, and then we had to work 6 days a week. Now we're working 5. But I think as productivity, and we can't help it as humans, it's not possible. We want productivity, and we do that. It's just us. So at some point, we have to address this, and we have to address what that means. And how we actually also, this is another hotbed question, how we spread wealth when we do that. So I think this is another it's a big question.
I'd add to that. I mean, I guess I'm throwing the ball a little further down the court as far as that's concerned. But wouldn't it be great if we lived in a society where we didn't have to depend on a certain level of income to make it, where we do things based on our desire to contribute to a better world that's based on our own interests, and that's a very big paradigm shift. I mean, that's hundreds of years in the future, but wouldn't that be wonderful if we could get there? But with the automation that's occurring, I mean, that could be a very real conversation. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of upheaval to get there, though. You're talking about changing the way we think and the way we even view ourselves and how we operate in society as a whole. But that would bring us to more of a humanist level than a capitalist level of let's advance society because for the good of all, rather than for us to make another extra buck in that respect. But the short term, I completely agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
All right, great. Well, thank you all very much for coming out, and please let's thank our speakers. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, guys.